Okay. I want to just warmly welcome everyone to the first event in a series at the GTU Center for Jewish Studies called Conversations at CJS. I am Sam Shonkoff. I am a professor of Jewish Studies here. And the idea behind this series is to hear from some brilliant scholars and also to put an emphasis though on discussion, dialogue, conversation among them. So we're going to hear just 10 minutes or so from each of our wonderful panelists or discussants today. And then we invite you also as audience members to help stoke this discussion with your own questions. Feel free to put them in the Q&A field at the bottom of your screen when they arise for you as you're listening to these presentations. The title of today's program is Dimensions of Time and Space in Rabbinic Literature. And I will just introduce all three of our speakers in the order in which they will speak, and then we'll dive in. So I'm so pleased to welcome first Richard Hidary to this program. He is a professor of Judaic studies at Yeshiva University, a rabbi at Sephardic Synagogue, and a faculty member of the Wexner Heritage Program. He's the author of Dispute for the Sake of Heaven, Legal Pluralism in the Talmud, as well as the book Rabbis and Classical Rhetoric, Sophistic Education and Oratory in the Talmud and Midrash. He's also currently writing a new translation and commentary on Masechet Sanhedrin, and also recording a popular series of Daf Yomi classes available on YouTube. And last but not least, I just learned that he went to high school with our very own Professor Deena Aranoff. But before we get there, Charlotte Fonrobert is a dear colleague and a professor of religious studies and Jewish studies at Stanford University, whose scholarship focuses on Talmudic literature and culture. She's the author of the award-winning book, Menstrual Purity, Rabbinic and Christian Reconstructions of Biblical Gender, and co-editor of the Cambridge Companion to the Talmud and Rabbinic Literature. And finally, my dear friend and colleague, Deena Aranoff, who is a professor of Jewish Studies here at the GTU and director of our Richard S. Dinner Center for Jewish Studies. Deena's recent scholarship offers groundbreaking investigations of how, this is my words, not hers, of how the much marginalized spheres of household, maternity, and child rearing have both produced and shaped the very foundations of Jewish culture. Help me and join me in welcoming our speakers. We can't hear you, but we feel your welcoming energy, and I will pass it over to you, Professor Hidary, please.
Thank you so much. I'm honored to be here today with such distinguished scholars. And thank you, Deena, for inviting me. It's really fun to have a panel together with you. So I'm going to focus on sacred space and sacred time and try to give a definition of what that means, especially for the rabbis of the Talmud. We'll talk about definitions and how they might relate to each other. And I hope that will be a good basis for Charlotte's remarks. So I'm going to borrow an idea from one of my favorite teachers, Moshe Halbertal. What does it mean for something, a person, time, space, an object to be holy? It means that we do not instrumentalize it. We do not use it for personal gain, for some other use besides its divine goal. So let's give some examples, and I'm going to share a few sources so that we can see them together. So here's a Mishnah in Brachot that says the temple mount, one may not enter it with the staff, shoes, money belt, dust on his feet, and it may not become a shortcut to pass through. If someone's on the north side and you want to pass through the south side, all right, even though it might take a little bit longer to go around, you can't just take a shortcut right through the temple, because then you're using that space not for itself, not for the service and what the prayers that are supposed to be there, but as a means to something else. And it should be rather an ends. This is taken to a bit of an extreme. And I love extreme examples because they really show just how far the rabbis will go with this. And so this is from the Talmud Bavli. And I wanted to share, this is from the new Koran edition that has pictures too. And here there's a Braita that mentions that there were, in the Holy of Holies, right? So now there's different levels. All of Israel has a level of holiness, and then Jerusalem, the Temple Mount, the courtyard, the sanctuary, and then the inner sanctuary, which is called the Holy of Holies. Each one is distinguished, as ritual theorists will tell us, by different actions one will have to do. Different people, right? It becomes more and more exclusive who can go there, and the types of actions that are allowed to be performed in each place. So in the Holy of Holies is the most, since because it's the highest level, one can derive no benefit from it. So what does that mean, no benefit? Okay, I know I'm not going to go and take a nap there. I'm not going to sit there and have a drink. So here it says, what if you needed repairs? Something on the floor, a floor tile popped, or right, it needs some painting. How is anyone going to go in there? So that had openings in the ceiling, and they would enter the artisan in a container. Why? So that their eyes would not gaze upon the Holy of Holies itself. The beauty, the architecture, should not be seen, because then you are using the Holy of Holies for your personal benefit, right? So not even anything, any physical, tangible benefit. I know, no one's going to take a temple vessel and start, drink coffee out of it. So this is quite an amazing extent, because that means, well, who's ever going to enjoy the beautiful gold and decorations in the Holy of Holies? The one time a year that the high priest goes in, he brings a smoke screen, so even then he can't enjoy it. So in this sense, that which is not instrumentalized becomes totally unusable and cannot even be enjoyed, benefited by basically anyone. Okay, so that's an extreme. Now, the same definition that we have for the temple, we see transformed to the synagogue. How does one treat a synagogue? So even if it's in ruins, one should not eulogize it, or since it's a wide space, stretch out ropes and twine ropes in it, spread traps in it, use it to put out fruit to dry. And when one may not make it a shortcut kapandria, same word as in Mishnah Brachot, the rabbis say, okay, there's no temple, but now the synagogue will be our replacement. That'll be our local temple. And so, and interesting, when a synagogue is destroyed, then we make sure not to keep it neat, because it will bring anguish and maybe someone will rebuild it. A kind of similarity between a destroyed temple and a destroyed synagogue. So we in a way become full circle, because the Torah itself does not talk about a permanent temple, but rather a movable structure, and picturing a movable, the people of Israel moving in the desert. And all these levels are originally where the inner circle is, where the ark was carried, and then the Levites and the Israelites. And so as they move around, this is meant to be a movable structure wherever they go. It becomes stationary for political reasons, right, the centralization of worship and of the Judean dynasty. But then, even though it's a negative that the temple was destroyed, the rabbis in a way are revisiting an important past and making it movable, democratizing once again. And it goes even a step further. I'm gonna skip this that says you can't even eat in it or take a walk in a synagogue. The synagogues are study houses in Babylonia, so study houses also receive that same sense of purpose. And then source number 6, as long as the temple was standing, the altar would atone for Israel. Now a person's table atones for him, so we actually bring it home. And so that holiness is brought home, and now one's table one should use to speak words of Torah, eat meals on Shabbat. And so that is a good transition to holiness of time. So Shabbat, what makes Shabbat holy? Well, first of all, the way we have boundaries before and after it. It's holy because we don't perform creative work on it. We're not preparing for after Shabbat. We're not using that time for anything mundane. The opposite of kodesh is chol, which really is the same root as sand, something ordinary. This is special time. And we mark it by doing one last creative act before and after. We begin the Sabbath by lighting 2 fires, 2 lamps, and end it with Havdalah, also lighting a fire. And fire is representative of human creativity. This is my last source, that 2 things God decided to create on the eve of the Sabbath, and were not given over until the termination of the Sabbath. And so at the termination of the Sabbath, God inspired Adam with the knowledge of a kind similar to divine knowledge, and so gave him the idea to get 2 stones, rub them together, and got a fire, also to cross 2 animals and come up with a mule. So fire, and maybe you'll think of Prometheus, right, giving over a fire to mankind, going against the wishes of Zeus, who wanted humankind to be slaves. And here, God giving them the power of creativity during the week, but on the Sabbath to abstain. This is time that's holy in and of it, given and so should be used only for itself, to enjoy time as time. And in this way, so time it becomes. Can I read one quote from Heschel from the Sabbath? This is one of my favorites. Indeed, the splendor of the day is expressed in terms of abstentions, just as the mystery of God is more adequately conveyed via the negative in the categories of negative theology, which claims that we can never say what he is, only what he is not. And so the Sabbath, by saying all the things that we may not do, becomes in a way a foreshadow of the world to come, which we can celebrate at each point. And I think this is part of the transition from temple times to non-temple times. On the one hand, the temple itself becomes so holy that we can never go there again, until and here we have time and space coming together until the Messianic era. Instead, that holiness is transferred to our local, becomes movable, to synagogues, to study spaces, to homes. And specifically, time becomes in a way more important than holy space, because it's that which you can take anywhere, and also is in a way even holier than space, because space can be bounded, but time has moves on its own, and in that way is an even more appropriate representation of the holy. So I'll end with a definition for God, right? What is God? HaKadosh, that which may not be instrumentalized at all to any degree. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much, Professor Hidary. That is a beautiful launch pad for us to move forward from now. I turn it over to you, Dr. Fonrobert, please.
Thank you, Sam, and Sam and Deena, for putting this together, and greetings from the South Bay up to my intellectual home in Berkeley. So I want to talk briefly by way of introduction. I guess I want to focus on thinking about the dimension of space and spatiality in Jewish culture, although arguably time and space are never separated dimensions, much as they may be distinct. And now I'm going to switch to, wait a minute, share. Okay. Great. Right, and I start in a way where Ricky, you took off, and thank you for that, which is that time and again we are told that Judaism is or we could think about Judaism as a religion of time, and of course the classic. I think it's called an FGS classic. The FGS, Heschel's beautiful book on the Sabbath of Palestine time makes that suggestion, that much of a suggestion, that we can think of Judaism as a religion of time. There are other books recently that deal with this and foreground, along with the rabbis, arguably foreground the dimension of time. There's a typo. Sarit Gribitz's beautiful little book on time and difference in Rabbinic Judaism, Lin Kay, time in the Babylonian Talmud. So when we think about the Judaism that I know best, which is rabbinic literature, then clearly, seemingly, that foregrounds time and temporality. As I think Sarit also starts out her book with, is the very first word of the Mishnah. The opening words is, from what time on do we recite the Shema? Everyone knows that. So, right, so it seems that the Mishnah as a project wants to channel us in on the dimension of time. And lastly, wait a minute, I have to move you up here. And one entire order is devoted to the dimension of time in the Mishnah, which foregrounds, again, right, the creation of Jewish time as a rhythm that marks Jewish particularity and distinction within the imperial worlds of Rome and its holidays. And I listed some of the treatises here that deal with that. And so in that sense, for the Mishnah and going forward in Rabbinic Judaism, the Jewish calendar is a medium to translate a Jewish past into a Jewish present, and to relate a Jewish present also in some ways to cosmic time, meaning to creation. So now comes, of course, my however, which is why I'm here, that, as we also just heard from Ricky, the calendar is, of course, embedded in Rabbinic Judaism and in Rabbinic culture, in spatiality, in the spatial dimension, or maybe one can think about that in different modalities of space. And a couple of the maps that the rabbis give us is, on the one hand, as we also just heard, the temple or the Beit HaMikdash, the sanctuary at the center, is sort of a centrifugal notion of space, right? With the center, at the center, the Beit HaMikdash, and it's outside the Medina. And the famous passage, the most famous passage, of course, is in MISHNAH Kelim on the 10 degrees of holiness that move from Kedusha, that move from the land at large, all the way into the Kodesh Kodashim, into the Holy of Holies. And then the other map would be the being in the land and Chul outside the land, and some of the mitzvot being dependent on positionality within or without the land. And then lastly, domestic space versus, and that's maybe something we can discuss also more, domestic space versus a communal space of the synagogue. Or the Beit Midrash for that matter, but the synagogue maybe more prominently as a communal space. So the one thing I wanted to gloss here is that, in a way, the temple, the Beit HaMikdash, that first map is indexed by the past, right? Because by the time we get to the Mishnah, much as the Mishnah in large parts also conceives of the temple in terms of the present, historically is already in the past, and that will be reflected much more strongly in the Bavli. I want to add an additional modality to this, which comes to us from related to the Sabbath, which comes to us from ERUVIN, which I want to think about as a more radical and maybe more rabbinic modality of space. So ERUVIN is a treatise that is eminently concerned with the spatial, much as it's dependent, of course, on the Sabbath. And you've seen, if you go back for 1 second, right, ERUVIN is a sister treatise of Shabbat, which makes a very prominent moment almost in that order because it foregrounds space, right, in the second place after Shabbat. So ERUVIN, we can think about, just maybe I should comment since I stole that this morning for the slide. This is also one of the manuscripts. This is one of the treatises in the MISHNAH Bavli that has most of the diagrams in the commentaries. And there are scholars who trace that, right? Or the diagrams of the various spaces about which ERUVIN treats. So a couple of comments on that, which is we might think about ERUVIN as a project on how to unite the neighborhood, the urban neighborhood, of creating a social space for the Sabbath. And so I'll foreground here more than sacred space. I want to foreground social space. Meaning in a way that it's not restricted, that the Sabbath is not restricted to the domestic sphere, just to the, if you want, to the shulchan at home, and also not to the communal space or the liturgic space of the synagogue, but really makes the city a genuine social space for the Sabbath, in that the household or one household sphere of the individual, Reshut HaYachid, is connected with its neighboring household. And we do that, the rabbis envision that primarily through food symbolism. This is one of the most prominent stories, the story I go back to again and again, and I hope that Deena and Sam are not getting more. It's such a beautiful story, right? Just to foreground this for 1 second, is on how the households get connected. Is the Yerushalmi, the Palestinian Talmud, reflects in this treatise on the reason, on the underlying reason why we do this association. And I never know the best translation for ERUVIN, but why do we unite the households that are associated through the courtyard? It's for the sake of shalom, of peace. And then they give us the case story of a woman who was on bad terms, was fighting with her neighbor, and she sent then her contribution to the Eruv food, the food symbolism that brings the two households together. And the neighbor took him and hugged and kissed him, and he went and told his mother, and she said, this is how he loved me, and I did not know about it, and because of this they made peace. So you have here you have a sort of classic example of ritual functionalism in the Bavli, is that we do the ritual in order to restore the social peace in the neighborhood. So the couple more comments, which is that the preeminent, so I want to suggest that the preeminent spaces that the MISHNAH thinks with, and therefore Rabbinic Judaism to a certain degree, is the Chatzer and the Mavo, or Mavoy, the joined courtyards and the alleyways or small streets, right? And here I give you a couple of examples from the treatise that foreground those urban spaces, meaning they think with the infrastructure of towns and of the towns, obviously the towns that the MISHNAH or the rabbis of the MISHNAH live in, but that gets then turned into paradigmatic urban spaces that Jewish law continues to think with to this day. And those are the spaces in the urban infrastructure that enable our social lives of joining the courtyards together and to live our lives as social. And that, of course, gains in a whole different resonance in this Corona year. And so I want to end with emphasizing, right, on why insisting on embedding the temporal dimension of the, and I'm going to unshare, so if I can't remember how to do that. Embedding time in social space is because that way we can foreground the neighborhood and follow the MISHNAH in foregrounding the neighborhood as a social space for where Judaism can be lived. And I guess I want to connect to Ricky here just briefly to sort of suggest that it lends itself particularly to diaspora on having a space outside the outside a Jewish space outside the domestic sphere. And number two, important for me also in terms of thinking this through is by that, the social community of the neighborhood becomes important or quintessential for the rabbis to think with, meaning, as we've seen here, the women and thinking with the diversity of people in the neighborhood rather than transcendent above it in the Beit Midrash. So with that, I'll end. How much did I go? Okay.
Thank you so much, Professor Fonrobert. There's already amazing connections that are starting to emerge, and I just want to remind our audience members out there, please feel free to put questions in the Q&A, and you get bonus points if your questions draw connections between papers or ask questions that kind of help our speakers converse with one another. I turn this over now to Professor Aranoff.
Thank you, Sam. Of course, it's very hard for me now going third not to imagine that my role now is to synthesize, but I'll do my best to kind of maintain some of the distinct points that I had here, although I really do find that it's very productive for me to think with what Ricky introduced in terms of the role of instrumentality in defining the sacred, and also Charlotte's insistence on not quite distinguishing between temporal and spatial dimensions. I'm not a physicist, but I think that's what they're saying these days anyway about space and time. So we could catch up as rabbinicists. It's also hard to go third because, understandably, of course, Heschel's language regarding the Sabbath and the first Mishnah of Brachot, Me'e Matai, in many ways, that's the starting point, and it's mine as well, that whatever could be said, we know that time is a construct, and actually in COVID, given the fact that so many of those constructs, the regular behaviors of our human collectives have been interrupted, so many of us have had this direct experience of like our sense of time, losing our sense of time because it's so formed by the routines of collective behaviors. So when those are disrupted, who knows what day it is? So we're had a radical and tragic firsthand experience of the fact that our sense of time is forged through our participation in activity in social environments, as Charlotte was saying. And so when we come back to think about time and constructions of time, the rabbinic practices, the halacha as it's articulated and regulated in the Talmud, is an astounding pattern of time. It's just sort of these patterns of ritual that just lace themselves across reality and shape it into temporal units, many of which don't exist naturally, but are forged through human behaviors and regularized behaviors. Things that are unbroken become broken up. Things that are broken up can be made whole and granted new meaning. So all of these significations of the natural world are produced through the temporal schema that is rabbinic practice. And so in that sense, I really think that palaces of time are created through rabbinic practice. The question that I am so excited to bring to this group in our discussion, which I'll make sure that we leave, plenty of time for it, is I have this sense that part of what the rabbinic claim is that it provides a total schema, that there isn't actually anything outside of the schema as it is presented, nothing quite outside the reach. And we can talk more about it. Is there any part of the human experience that cannot be regulated by halacha, that is out of reach? And I'll give an example about this, because is it possible, and here's the critique that's commonly brought, it's brought to Heschel, and you could bring it to halacha more generally. The critique is rabbinic time and the obligations of observations as they relate to time assume a person with tremendous amount of agency and freedom. Like, oh, I have to go pray mincha. I'm glad that you want to go do that. But the amount of agency and freedom that a person who can do that is pretty amazing. And I do have to say, my great uncle, may he live to 120, but he lives in Los Angeles. He's 97 years old. And he tells me that when he was growing up in Williamsburg, on Shabbat, there were two services: the early morning service for the people who afterwards would go to work, and the regular time. And so just a few generations ago, it was assumed that not everybody was wealthy enough to get to determine which days they were working. But the synagogues were accommodating that by hosting Shabbat services for people who then needed to go to work. So clearly we're in there's also important kind of socioeconomic factors at play. But what about the fact that halacha assumes the kind of intact volition? I can volitionally choose what I'm doing at any given time, first of all. Second of all, that I can ritually alter the task at hand. This comes up in a study, Tamara Orr, who has a great article in Tal Ilan's Feminist Companion to the Study of the Talmud, who talks about how in Masechet Beitzah, in Tractate Beitzah, the rabbis are trying to suggest ritual alterations to food preparation so that food preparation on the festival days is not exactly like what you would do on a regular day. So when you prepare foods, don't prepare it in bulk. Don't do everything in the very systematic, efficient ways that you might be working in a regular kitchen. On the festival days, do smaller portions, or even do it in a slightly modified way, carry it differently, sift things differently. But what's really interesting to me is that in Masechet Beitzah, there's a tension, because the problem is that some of these actions, if you alter them for ritual purposes, you make bad food. So there's story after story of the rabbinic, male rabbinic voice saying, you know what, just make sure I get good bread. This really interesting gender inversion where the women in the household are following the kind of ritual alterations dictated by halacha, and the rabbinic male authority is saying, well, just rake out the oven. You found a rock in it, just rake it out. So you can see tension there between the kitchen practices are not easily modified by rabbinic dictates. They are determined by the practicalities, by feasibility. And one of the only ways for the rabbis to actually achieve jurisdiction over that realm is through license, which is one of the ways to read Eruv. Eruv could be understood as an effort to, I keep imagining a net, to throw a net over these households that have comings and goings and carrying foodstuff and children. And if you decided that none of that was permitted, well, good luck, because that kind of movement is going to carry on. But the Eruv it covers the territory. So I'll end with one more example that's all about this question, which is, can the rabbinic schema cover everything? What about the fact that not everyone has the kind of agency that is assumed? What about the fact that there are certain relentless constant demands that's part of being human, that is not quite, I'll just call it not receptive to ritual alterations. So the example, and here's the example I've brought many times, so the colleagues of mine who've heard this forgive me, but my example is actually that of dirty diapers. So there's a famous and actually quite troubling Mishnah in Masechet Shabbat, in which it's almost difficult to present, but for 3 transgressions, women die in childbirth for their neglect of the laws of Nidah, Chala, and kindling the Sabbath lamps. Very difficult Mishnah. I actually suggest that the kind of unusual punitive tone of that Mishnah is actually an indication of the fact that, again, there's a relatively weak rabbinic jurisdiction over Shabbat laws, Nida laws. And so there's a kind of, you almost hear the Mishnah shouting, you're going to get punished, because actually in terms of who really has the authority in executing these halachot, it is the women. But at the end of the Gemara is an alternative text. Forgive me, I won't do screen share, but it just on page 32a in Masechet Shabbat. For 3 sins women die in childbirth, Rav Acha says, for the transgression of laundering the filth of their children, the diapers. So at b'neihem. Absolutely outrageous comment. In many ways, knowingly taking the harsh language of the Mishnah and pairing it with something so mundane as dirty diapers. Why would washing dirty diapers provoke this kind of punishment? And what I want to just say is, here's the problem with dirty diapers. Dirty diapers don't lend themselves to rabbinic control. Your house will smell like feces. And the halacha, it seems, can't manage it. Now, technology changes everything. Now we have diaper genies, you put it in, it gets sucked into this plastic bag and you don't have to smell anything for weeks, but you can have entire hospitals in Israel, entire hospitals that have the light switches set up so that if they're used in certain situations, there's a way in which it's rather only indirectly turning on the light. It becomes a grama technology, so that if you turn on the light for a choleh, for someone who's sick, you're only indirectly doing it. But you really have to imagine that before technology, there was all the time coming at people the demands of the human body that resist ritual alteration, something that halacha has a hard time reaching and touching. Yeshayahu Leibovich, who was really thinking hard about the modern state of Israel, for example, wondered, how could halacha accommodate the unceasing demands of the state? I would put waste management, it's like the dirty diaper case, but for an entire state. How could we halachically manage the waste system of a state? That's the question. And if you do figure out how halacha could do this, will it even be recognizable as halacha any longer? Is halacha actually a diaspora mode that actually is much more comfortable dealing with a small set of people with a tremendous amount of volition, and has kind of weak points where it can't quite cover everything? This is my question, and I'll end with it.
Amazing. Thank you so much to all 3 of you. And I want to just open this up to the 3 of you first before injecting the discussion with other questions. If you have questions for one another or have issues where you want to begin this discussion, please go for it.
Deena, I think you began answering your question at the end. One thing outside the reach of halacha is the future. A state of Israel, and how do we renegotiate what happens to the Temple Mount when we now regain access to it? And in 67, it's amazingly the rabbinic establishment that said we are not allowed to go there went hand in hand with the political establishment that said we don't want to make a war about this right now. And so it was out of bounds. And so it's so holy that we all are in agreement about the status quo. And well, we can witness how that changes. But now the Kotel area, plaza, becomes a center point. And you talked about dirty diapers. I was present there when the woman of the wall came, and one of the few items that was thrown at them was dirty diapers. So that's kind of interesting. And then thinking about Shabbat as a foreshadowing of the future, well, now that we have sovereignty and safety and prosperity, and so is this Messianic times? Is this the beginning of it? What else are we hoping for? So it was important in diaspora to always be hoping, but once in order to be waiting, it cannot actually come, because then you're not waiting anymore. So how do we now redefine or rethink of holy time and space when both our land and the time period are fundamentally different?
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Ricky. Just one quick also response, which is, it made me think the way you phrased it, Deena, the question of, right, is it a total schema, or the project of halacha as a total project. But I mean, of course, then you think of I thought of the famous, right, who's that, Rabbi Chia's statement, right, that from the day that the Beit HaMikdash was destroyed, the Holy One of Blessing all he has in the world is the 4 amot of halacha. Right, so then you want to think it's right. However one conceives the 4 amot of halacha, that space within which we, the rabbis, do our thing, our project. However we analyze that project, it's by definition a self-restrictive process. So they're not claiming. So it's not just the future that we're claiming. We are also not claiming, right, in that sense. You could almost say, foregrounded as an anti-imperial model of this, right? We're not covering the entire world. We're not laying claim to humanity as a whole. We are laying claim to the particularity of this particular group of people, which we define in this and that way, and we may have problems with that, the way we define that, right, in terms of what happens to women and right, you know the whole thing, right? So then that's one thing of sort of a self-restrictive approach in a way, right? So there is an outside of halacha by definition, so to speak, because we're not interested in making law for the goyim, so to speak, right? And so that's where, for me, the ERUVIN business is also not like, it's not like casting a net over the city. It's right. It's in a way, it's a project that by definition can live only from negotiation with, not superimposing on the others. But the thing will only work, right, doing this neighborhood project, if that's how you want to think about it, if you actually can get to talk with them, and you can get them to agree, and if you can go to the city council, and if you can go blah, 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 right? And so it sets up a schema where, right, you have to actually figure out how you negotiate this thing with the others. So it's not like superimposing on, but sort of negotiating with. And that, I think, is potentially it has a lot in terms of being politically suggestive.
Can I go back to something, Ricky, that you started with and explore it a little bit? The definition of the sacred is not instrumentalized, which, as you were defining it, I was very taken with it. Something like aspirational about it, to have any relationship in which it exists for itself only. And at the same time, in my own scholarship, I find that what I keep doing again and again is insisting upon the instrumental nature of religion. So, so for example, if what is sacred is not instrumentalized, but the synagogue, this is a great, the shul is a million things. It's a place where people schmooze and eat and use the restrooms and welcome guests and sleep. It's a guest house. In Shabbat, the text that I shared, one of the in the series of alternative versions to why do people die young or in childbirth, one of the examples was for calling the Aron HaKodesh Arna. Women call the Aron HaKodesh, that's the high register language that's appropriate, but they call it Arna, some kind of Aramaic vernacular. Or Amei Ha'aratzot, ignoramuses, uneducated, non-rabbinic types that call the synagogue Beit Am instead of calling it Beit Knesset. All of this is, so you see in these texts, there's a struggle between the everyday vernacular forms that is one way to define what these spaces are, and this goal for it to have a register that's more exclusive. So how do you handle that tension?
Right, good. That's a great insight. I think the letter of the law in the original sources say one may not sleep or eat or speak. I mean, it's really considered very holy. As time goes on, you see that communal aspect. The great synagogue of Alexandria, right? That's described in the Talmud, where everybody sat by profession. So the tailors would sit together and share some of their resources, and then a new person can come and immediately have an economic network. And then over in the history of halakha, there's all kinds of exceptions. You can bring food if you're celebrating a brit milah or a mitzvah. And so now you are allowed to use it as long as it's for a communal benefit. So it becomes a center, but that in itself is a holy goal. It's not just because I'm hungry. I'm allowed to eat here because I'm listening to a lesson of Torah. So now it's helping me through that. Right, but in some way it becomes the difference nowadays between Orthodox and liberal synagogues. And the Orthodox, everybody's talking, and the liberal ones, everything's quiet and very serene and respectful. And you get that kind of shock when you go from one to the other. While I have the microphone, I thought maybe I would respond to the Hareat Mikudeshet Li question. From Peretz, right? So what does that mean during the first stage of marriage, when a man says to the woman, "You are sanctified unto me"? Technically, that means she is off limits to anyone else. So that fits with non-instrumentality, right? No other man in the world will be allowed to marry her. It still does not form the bond between that husband and wife. So that fits with the definition of instrumentality. The question is then what happens at the next step when they do become a couple, and how does one have a relationship without instrumentalizing the other? And so that becomes a great struggle, because look, it's easy to do with a being who you can't see and can't hear, and then or even someone who's very far away. It's easy to be a Kantian and not instrumentalize people you've never met, but people actually have to deal with and negotiate who's going to wash the dishes and who's going to change the diapers. Then to maintain that sense of respect, mutual partnership in a context of kedusha, right, is something that we also have to negotiate in our relationship with God, who is he who gives us everything. And so Halbertal likes to say God has the problem of the rich husband or rich wife, but it's usually rich husband. We have Coming to America 2 is coming out, so this is very relevant, right? How does the rich husband ever know that his wife loves him for himself or for all that he gives? And God has that ultimate problem because he gives everything. So how does he know that anyone is faithful? Because, well, he, of course, what other choice would one have? And so those are the tests of Job and the tests of Abraham.
Beautiful. If I may just inject another question in here. I'm really fascinated with this tension between the definition that you offered, Richard, of God, of Hakadosh, as that which can never be instrumentalized. I mean, I'm coming at this also as a Buber scholar, where God is the eternal you, that which can never be objectified or made some sort of dealt with in a utilitarian way. And then Deena, this tension that you want to introduce here of, well, isn't everything instrumentalized? Isn't religion, isn't the whole halachic system something that is structuring reality and creating these spaces where everything actually does have some sort of like multi-purpose function and is serving some social function, some social role? And I'm wondering if there's some dialectic there, like if it's possible, if halakha is maybe doing both somehow at the same time, if it's offering ways to not instrumentalize that which is constantly being used. And I think, Charlotta, what you brought in here also of this diasporic shift, like into the domestic sphere, into the neighborhood, to the shulchan, to the table, the dinner table, which is like the epicenter of instrumentalization, right? Like this is the dinner table where we're cooking, where we're feeding children, where we're doing all this stuff for utilitarian purposes. Like what resources does this rabbinic project offer for visions of having a non-instrumentalizing relationship with the mundane sphere, with that which is generally instrumentalized? I'm curious if that brings up anything for any of you.
I loved hearing how you were bringing that together, and also just describing, yes, it is something like an aspirational. I'm sorting it out. I think someone in the questions also asked about a spectrum where, yeah, like, or a dialectic. Let's get this out of the binary. And I'm always guilty of kind of trying to set these clear distinctions. But I'll just give an example for Shabbat candles, which Heschel and Ricky, you refer to it, raise up, as the kind of the ritual that marks this time as sacred and pulls it out of the work, the instrumental work of everyday life. But as I've shared this with some of you, it's my sense that lighting Shabbat candles was actually a very utilitarian measure that was taken, because if you're not allowed to kindle a flame on the Sabbath itself, then right beforehand you light the candles. So candle lighting was entirely instrumental, practical. I don't know what you want to call it. It comes from that place. Similarly, 2 loaves of bread. I shared this. All of these realizations, by the way, came to me in my own personal Shabbat practice, where on Friday, I realized I had to prepare 2 jugs of this almond milk, this very Berkeley. And I said, I have to prepare 2. And every Friday I'm putting the 2 jugs into the fridge. And I thought, oh my gosh, of course there's 2 loaves of bread on Friday night. You can't bake the bread the next day. And as I'm running around my house, turning on this light and turning off that light and setting a Shabbat clock, and I say, oh my gosh, Shabbos candles that was everyone lighting the lights before you couldn't light lights anymore. So it's just to say that function is in sometimes what actually generates these practices that become sacred. And maybe to soften the binary, just to say that what the definition of sacred is not that it isn't instrumental, but that there's a little gap made between the activity and its function of awareness. So it's just, you're just no longer just eating, but you've somehow engineered it that you know that you're eating. And it's a layer of consciousness that is what creates the sacred.
Yeah, now I'm trying to wrap myself, my head around that. But Sam, I mean, I guess, right, Ricky also, to the definition of the sacred as that which cannot be instrumentalized, right? I'm not sure, right, the sort of quasi-phenomenological approach that how meaningful that is in the end. If that which is sacred or is kadosh for the rabbis is always that which we make so, whether we do that by not working on the Sabbath and withdrawing from activity that, right, it's that which is sacred is never just a given, it's always a performative. So by definition, you want to say there is always an instrumental aspect built into the rabbinic. I mean, I'm thinking this through now, right? An instrumental dimension built into that notion of the sacred, right? So then I mean, I guess that's more a question rather than right, as one thinks that through, but yeah.
Right. Maybe just to pick up on those comments, and especially Deena's, that I'm just trying to compare the conception of the Sabbath of the rabbis with that of, let's say, the Dead Sea sect or the Karaites. And so they don't have lighting of Shabbat candles, and certainly the Karaites would not allow using fire at all. And I would say the Dead Sea sect is trying to stay away from materialism all week long, all year long. They wish it was Yom Kippur all the time. Some ancient Jews would fast on the Sabbath. And so that's really not interesting. Just like in the temple, synagogue, you don't eat or drink. On this day, you do not eat and drink. So the rabbis, by saying light the Sabbath candles, they're giving a positive view towards the creativity and material aspect of ourselves that we enjoy all week, and finding a way to bring some of that into the Sabbath. They want to make sure we have good food, and so we can keep it hot from before. They want to make sure we can cook and not compromise on the taste on Yom Tov. And in that way, they are celebrating the 6 days and using that as preparation in order to enliven, heighten the goal, which is then the Sabbath, but not that all weeks should be Sabbath.
Do we have time for one more question? Can we? Okay. This is a question from Glennis Lamb, and this question is: Deena, would you say that by the rabbis trying to regulate the household spheres, they are unintentionally pushing those spheres further outside halacha's reach and possibly creating a sphere undifferentiated from where they wish it to reside?
It's wonderful. Sam, I'm glad you threw that out there. And I know that we're short on time, but Glennis's work, Glennis is a graduate of the GTU who studied the architecture of synagogues in the land of Israel, even when the temple was standing, and observed that early synagogues have a lot of commonalities to household architectural design and elements. And she suggests that it is only later in the history of the synagogue, and in particular after the Christianization of the Roman Empire, that the synagogues, rather than facing in as a kind of extended household, like the bigger space where we can gather, like a big living room, but then reorients itself outward facing, kind of comparable to what the church would do as a public facing.
Only for Ashkenazim, right? Sfaradim always kept facing each other. We still do.
Amazing differences. I was using facing in and facing out in terms of almost like the facade of the building, but there are really interesting corollaries in terms of the internal architectural design. So quickly to just say that, let me end with Galit Chazan Rokem, who is a kind of honorary member of our World of Berkeley Scholarship, has a book called Tales of the Neighborhood, Jewish narrative dialogues in late antiquity. And she says, the discourse of the synagogue is created across its threshold, so to speak. And the wisdom of the rabbis is intertwined with the words of wise women. The discourse of the synagogue is created across its threshold. There isn't a strict separation between household life and the activity there and these rabbinic regulations. They're mutually informing systems. Just as in the Gemara I talked about, there's a name for the ark that circulates in the population that is not the name given by the rabbis. The rabbis effectively are not the sole determiners of what is sacred or what is religious register. There is a vernacular and there is a household system, and that actually can sometimes force the hand of halachic formulations. So I'm very glad that the two systems stayed connected, Glennis, to your question. I think the effect is a religious culture, what do I want to say, with a lot of humanity in it. So it has the medicine for the human condition because humans are conditioning it along the way.
Thank you so much to Deena, Richard, and Charlotta for a discussion that I feel like we're just starting to break into, but thank you so much for participating in this. I want to just give a quick plug before we leave to the next. We have 2 more programs in this Conversations at CJS series. The next one is March 18th at noon, called Homeland, Exile, and Diaspora, Contemporary Jewish Reflections. That'll be with Daniel Boyarin, Jill Hammer, and Susanna Heschel. And then we'll have another one on April 22nd at noon on Revelation and Contemporary Jewish Theology. That'll be a dialogue between Michael Fishbane and myself. And thank you to all of you for joining us today. Thank you so much to our 3 discussants, and we'll hopefully see you all soon. Take care.
Thank you, Sam.